The Long Road by Wolfland. The remainder of the day passed uneventfully, and in the evening, the trio camped out in the shade of the elevated bike path at the intersection of Route 103. Both trainer and Pokemon had missed the call of the open road, and no complaints were made when the next morning they set off towards the shady pathways of Route 103. The rarely traveled route proved to be a great place for Steven and his team to simply relax. The few trainers they did encounter along the way were understanding enough once they saw Steven's cast, and the battles they held were light and friendly. That night, they made camp on the small beach at the edge of Route 103. The soft sound of lapping waves lulled the group into a blissful sleep. The next morning, Steven held true to his word, and they began their trek back to Slateport. With the scenery no longer brand new, Steven found his mind wandering back to the idea of a new team member. So far, he had come up empty on potential. It's not that any of the Pokemon native to Route 110 weren't solid Pokemon, given proper training, but Steven didn't really find himself enamored with any of the types he saw, especially not that Gulpin. The hope that there might have been a decent rock type native to the area was growing fainter as the bike path came back into view. Finding his eyes drawn to the towering structure that overshadowed the winding path of grass and sea that comprised the rest of Route 110, something odd caught Steven's eye. A streak of yellow and green was darting along outside the safety railing. Beldam must have seen it too, because it quickly jerked to attention and chirped an alarm. Steven peered closer, and to both his amazement and horror, he realized that the brightly colored object was actually a Pokemon, an Electrike, and it was teetering dangerously close to the unprotected edge of the elevated path. How this Pokemon had gotten up there, Steven would never know, and he no longer had time to wonder either, as something or someone up on the bike path let out a loud shout, causing the Electrike to jump in surprise. Trying to recover from the sudden noise, the skittish Pokemon slipped, and its rear paw reached out and came in contact with nothing but air. Time seemed to slow as its back end followed suit, while its front paws scrabbled at the steel sides of the bike path in vain. Flecks of paint were scratched free, leaving only desperate claw marks in their wake as the Electrike tumbled backwards, helpless to stop its descent. Aron's frightened bark snapped Steven from his trance, and he broke into a sprint. With a heave, he flung his pack around his shoulder to grasp it at the front with his right hand. The motion was met with plenty of resistance, both from the sling and from his body, but with his eyes glued to the doomed Pokemon, it was easy to ignore. He was still running when his hand clamped down on an empty Pokeball. The Electrike had fallen so far already, but there was still time. Shedding his pack to the ground in one motion, he cocked his left arm back and threw the Pokeball with a shout of exertion. It wasn't a graceful throw, he was right-handed after all, but the trajectory looked sound. The breath caught in Steven's throat as he stared desperately at his throw, as if somehow he could simply will the Pokeball to strike its target, saving the hapless Electrike from its inevitable fate. The Pokeball sailed wide to the right as Beldam screeched in terror. With a dull thud, the Electrike hit the ground at the edge of Route 110, and the resulting momentum sent it somersaulting into the sea. Steven's heart sunk. Amazingly, a flash of yellow and green re-emerged from the water, followed by frantic splashing as the injured Pokemon tried to drag itself back to solid ground. But the Electrike was too stunned to battle against the current, and by the time Steven arrived at the water's edge, it had drifted too far out of reach. His mind raced as he heard the Electrike's yelping and whining as it struggled to stay above water. He had to do something, and fast. "Auron! My pack!" There was no telling how the terrified and injured Pokemon would react to being handled. He would have to rely on the same plan as earlier. Auron had returned to his side, pack in tow, grunting with the effort. Steven quickly dumped the bag on its side, bringing out every Pokeball he had left. As much as he wanted to panic and just throw them rapid fire, Steven hefted the first ball and paused to take a steadying breath. Face locked in concentration, he took aim and threw. With a splash, it missed the Electrike too far to the left. Steven stooped to collect another Pokeball and aimed again. This one splashed into the water too, but closer this time. Auron nosed another ball forward, and Steven picked up his third attempt, not entirely sure he could keep his nerves in check as the Electrike drifted further and further away. He drew in a breath and held it, then brought his arm forward. His aim was true, and for a brief moment, the Electrike slipped beneath the waves, and Steven feared the throw might be in vain, with no target for the Pokeball to strike. But then, yellow and green broke the surface once more, just in time for the Pokeball to bounce off its snout, and it vanished in a swirl of red light. Beldum chattered in celebration, but Steven was hesitant to join in. "Not yet," he muttered. "It could still break out." But as the ball bobbed in the water, the indicator light finally blinked off, and Steven exhaled in relief. He still somehow had to retrieve the ball, but at least the Electrike was no longer in danger of drowning. Thinking quickly, Beldum found a long tree branch, and together they used the extended reach to sweep the Pokeball to shore. Steven scooped it out of the water and jogged back to where Auron was waiting at his pack with a tight expression. The trio knew their little excursion was over for now. They needed to get Electrike to the Pokemon Center as fast as possible. Steven abandoned all subtlety as he burst through the Pokemon Center doors and hurried up to the nurse. Her face shifted from startled surprise to veiled disappointment to genuine concern in a matter of moments as she took in Steven's harried expression. He was short of breath as he placed a singular Pokeball on the desk. "I'll apologize for sneaking out later, but right now, I have a Pokemon that needs urgent care." Nurse Joy's stern expression returned in full force. "There's a very good reason the doctor's orders were to avoid training while you were still healing." Steven shook his head. "It's not one of mine. It was in trouble, so I caught it." His shoulders slumped even as the nurse's gaze softened. "I didn't know what else to do." Gently picking the Pokeball off the counter, Nurse Joy politely bowed. "You did the right thing. I'll let you know when you can see it." And with that, she swept away into the depths of the center. When Steven got back to his room, he shrugged his bag off unceremoniously and slumped onto the bed, letting his head fall into his one good hand. For some reason, he couldn't shake that Electrike from his thoughts. It wasn't even his Pokemon, and yet he still found himself worried. As he continued to silently puzzle over why one wild Pokemon could make his chest feel so tight, Auron and Beldum both looked on with concern.